Hey guys, it's Tom here. I'm super excited to announce a new podcast series, Metaverse Musings, hosted by our own Piers Kicks. This additional podcast to our channel will focus on gaming, interactive media, and the metaverse. Also, stay tuned for a big announcement in the near future where we will drop additional hosts, shows, and our expansion plans. I'm excited for you guys to listen to Piers' first episode, so dive in. One quick housekeeping item. Nothing said on this podcast is a solicitation to buy or sell any security or token, or to make any financial decisions. Also, all advertisements and podcast sponsors are strictly for informational purposes only and not endorsements of any products or services. I may personally hold tokens mentioned on the podcast, and you can view our show notes below for our complete disclosures. Hey guys, I wanted to tell you how easy it is to open and fund an Alto crypto IRA. All you have to do is open a traditional Roth or SEP crypto IRA account, then get ready to invest. An Alto crypto IRA is specifically designed for crypto investments. You custody with Coinbase, trading's tax-free, investment minimums are as low as $10, and gains grow tax-deferred, meaning you don't pay taxes until you start to take money out of your IRA. You can visit and open an account by visiting altoira.com/chainreaction. With that, let's jump into the episode.
Hey everyone, and thank you for tuning into the inaugural episode of Metaverse Musings. As part of Delphi's expansion, we're rolling out a number of thematic series across the Delphi podcast. For those that don't yet know me, my name is Piers Kicks. I'm going to be covering more on the intersection of decentralized technologies with video games and interactive media at Delphi. Metaverse Musings investigates the integral components behind what many believe will be the internet's successor, a virtual extension of the natural world where most of us will eventually live, work, and play. To some, it represents our next great milestone as a network species, and to others, it is something to fear. With our guests, we discuss the technology, philosophy, and culture behind this brave new world. My guest today is John Egan, the CEO of L'Atelier, which is a BNP Paribas subsidiary that describes itself as an analytical foresight company. They look to map trends they believe will dramatically transform the world around us in the years ahead. John and his team flashed up on the radars of many lately after they published their landmark virtual economy report, which I'll link in the show notes and highly recommend everyone reads. As someone that has grown up deeply submerged in video games, virtual economies, and the forums and marketplaces that orbit them, I was blown away at both the breadth and the depth of the report and the team's ability to articulate their findings in a way that doesn't alienate an outsider looking in. Not only that, the entire piece is gorgeously illustrated and is much more of an interactive, animated experience than a regular research report. So John, welcome aboard and thank you very much for joining me today.
Thanks, Piers. I'm delighted to be your first guest. Very honoured. Thank you very much.
Yeah, it's exciting stuff. So it would be great if you could give us a bit of a rundown of your personal background and what you've done and kind of how it's equipped you for what you do now.
Sure. My background is predominantly economics, and I had sold a couple of businesses quite young, engineering businesses and a finance business, and then I was the CEO of a network technology company, and then I was a VC in London for a number of years, and more recently I joined L'Atelier as the CEO. So I'm in situ now for 2 years, building out the new business. So it's been an enjoyable ride so far.
Awesome. And yeah, could you tell us a bit about L'Atelier's history and focus, sort of how the team was assembled, the relation to BNP Paribas, the kind of tools and methodologies you use, and kind of the overall mission objective?
Yeah, of course. So the business is quite old. It's 40 years old now. So it's got this heritage of innovation and technology and foresight through generations at this point. And it would have a significant brand, especially amongst a certain cohort of kind of executives in France. It used to have its own TV show and its own radio show and a partnership with Le Monde. So it was somewhat ubiquitous when it came to technology and innovation in France. The company itself now, we focus on, you mentioned in the intro, we focus on foresight. So what are the new markets that are emerging at the intersection of technological and social change over the next decade? And we're trying to identify those spaces. What's the next Google internet search, or what's the next e-commerce, or what's the next cloud computing or social media? And we try and do this by adding a qualitative layer, obviously, but to quantitative inputs on things like emerging technology and sentiment and behavior. And we see how different cohorts are going to intersect over the next decade. And from that, we try to form various different thematic opportunity spaces out of these kind of frontier signals. And in doing so, we can identify an emerging market like the virtual economy. And from that, we can use that intelligence in a number of different ways. Obviously, it can be used for strategic insight and strategic planning. It can also be used as investment intelligence. So that's the nuts and bolts of our business.
Okay, that's really cool. And so, are there any sort of particular themes that sort of get moved up the food chain and have already been invested in that L'Atelier has covered?
This is our first big one. So bearing in mind, my first kind of year in situ, we went through a lot of changes as we reworked the business, and we had a number of international offices as well. So that was primarily a review process. So this was the one that I actually wanted to lead with. It was the one that was kind of in my mind anyway. And then we did the research and we substantiated it. And we've done some other projects as well on privacy and on deep fakes and various different technology pieces. But the challenges that emerge around them. But this was our first big kind of opportunity space piece as a thematic, and to begin to explore not just the philosophy and the architecture and infrastructure of the space, but also the investment opportunities and the partnership opportunities that might emerge beyond that. So this will be something that we continue to work on, certainly over the next year, and in all likelihood, we will continue beyond that. But this is just the first chapter of this project for us, the report that we released.
Amazing. Yeah. Could you then leads nicely on to, could you provide a kind of high level summary of what you originally set out to do in this virtual economy report?
Yeah. Okay. So the original intention was to create something seminal to help a larger, broader audience understand this space who may not have been technically savvy or technologically fluent, and therefore are somewhat divorced from it. So I think what we were trying to do is establish it to create a kind of a vernacular and a point of view that was authoritative and credible, that could be referred to, because even though we have been talking about various iterations of the metaverse for close to 40 years now, you typically find that there are very, very different interpretations. You ask 10 people, you'll get 10 different responses. So we wanted to ground that in some economic sensibility. That's not to say this report isn't exclusively about the metaverse. It's about the economic workings of an emerging metaverse. So we haven't, for instance, gone into a huge amount of depth in the community infrastructure, the psychology, the politics, the philosophy, the governance, etc. That is something we want to go into over time, and we're currently creating kind of shorter content around some of those ideas. But ultimately, this for us was to look at the prominent technologies, the emerging social change, and the market opportunity that was creating, and the existing economic infrastructure that supported it, and identified some of the gaps and where it's likely to lead to in the future. So that was the intention. I think we had originally done it for a broader, kind of more mainstream audience. And one of our concerns actually was that for the native population of people who are working on this all the time, we really weren't sure if it was going to connect with them, because our audience kind of first and foremost was to make it accessible to a broader community of people, so anybody could drop in and understand it. What we've been really pleased to see is actually it's got a really positive response from the people who are native to the space. It didn't feel too kind of introductory or too patronizing or derivative or anything else. They felt like it was really additive, which was fantastic.
Absolutely. No, I thought you guys did an incredible job at communicating it, as you say, in a way that was accessible to others, and definitely sort of resonated with those that kind of associate with the things you were writing about. If you had to choose then on the whole, what were the kind of major themes or findings from the report that stood out to you the most?
So that's a good question. And it's difficult to remember now if my own perspective changed a lot through the research and through the work. You kind of always got that bias where you feel like you already knew a lot of this, or you felt a lot of it, and it just proved it true to be true. So I am not sure in retrospect the things that really shocked me or surprised me, but certainly, I think when we begin to look at the nature of a workforce that's emerging in this space, is really interesting. But I think clearly the thing, and anybody who reads the report will tell very quickly that the thing that we were most interested in, the thing that we thought there was the most potential in, was the NFT environment and the ecosystem that is developing around NFTs. that is, that's a real step forward. And I think it's maybe the most significant step forward in the broader metaverse conversation in the last decade.
Absolutely. I agree sort of wholeheartedly on that point. I mean, to my mind, non-fungible tokens kind of represent the most elegant solution to the problem of digital scarcity and uniqueness. And if we are going to move towards this metaverse-style world, establishing trust and that kind of robust economic membrane seems to be of paramount importance. And yeah, the way I see it, the correct use of blockchain provides a unique degree of assurance in this regard. As we gravitate then towards this world that kind of looks like a metaverse, do you foresee decentralized technologies playing an integral part in its evolution?
Yes, but it's a really so this itself is kind of a loaded question. It's not an easy question to answer because traditionally, when we consider the metaverse, a lot of the historical interpretations of the metaverse were always centralized. The idea of a decentralized metaverse is actually quite a new concept, and it's pushing uphill to a large extent as well because there are real challenges about interoperability across platforms. So this idea of a kind of an oasis, a Ready Player One oasis style metaverse, is in some ways like the most likely one. You might have one of the really big tech companies who tried to construct something like this. They have a lot of the capacity to do so. However, it is not necessarily the one that everybody wants because even though the illustrations that we've seen previously about a metaverse have been centralized, centralization and the friction of centralization has never been prominent within that. So it's always been massively interoperable. They've always actually effectively, painted a picture of a decentralized universe that was owned by a single entity. So it makes it very, very challenging. So I think increasingly, though, NFTs are the foundation of the metaverse in a lot of ways because it's the economic incentive, it's the ability to create a commercial unit of trade, it's the ability to store value, it's the ability to attract people to employment within these spaces. It's the thing that really gets people to interact with in a more meaningful way. And the uses of it are just extraordinary. So I think that where decentralization kind of begins to fit in then is first and foremost through non-fungible tokens, but then beyond that, there are real opportunities for decentralized ID and authentication, authorization. I think that's going to be a big layer, and also there's security infrastructure that I think will be more effectively managed through decentralized platforms than it will be centralized platforms. So you should be able to control a lot of your identity infrastructure, your virtual asset wallet, your marketplace mechanics through a single owned but decentralized a kind of capsular hood that you should be able to manage all this through. But again, I think it is not it's not an either or situation. There is no workable metaverse that is just decentralized. There are possible ones that are centralized, but I don't know if they can really be hugely effective because you can never have real interoperability with a centralized metaverse. And we see it every day. People's behavior is such that they spend some of their time on Facebook or Twitter or TikTok or Instagram, and then they're on Amazon, then they're on Google platform, whatever, like YouTube. So they jump around. There needs to be interoperability through that, and it can't be facilitated just through monopoly ownership because monopolies don't produce good products. So we need product specialists, and that means third-party access. So it requires openness in whatever form it might take. I think the most likely one is through decentralized openness. So decentralized and distributed product manufacturing will be my view on it. So I think it will be better for decentralization. But the thing that really makes it necessary is NFTs, and this is why NFTs are so important because you can have almost everything else. You can have a centralized solution. Oftentimes, that centralized solution requires a trust me mechanism or a trust me promise. But the one thing that doesn't work for is NFTs because it's a store of value. And that idea of transferable wealth, something that you own, and unless there is a guarantee scheme that guarantees that wealth to you at an established value that has value in the real world as well, I think that's really difficult to do through centralized platforms. So that's why I think NFTs, in a very simple way, at their very core, become so paramount to the evolution of the metaverse and the decentralized elements of the metaverse.
Sure. I also think there's some merit to, kind of as Tim Sweeney proposes, from a kind of network architecture or actual compute architecture point of view, of this kind of federated model, which seems like a healthy kind of middle ground, which obviously could also interact with the whole NFT layer and still allow that economic component to be skewed towards the decentralized side. But
Yeah.
I also wonder then, with a federated model, like what does the metaverse look like behind the Great Firewall of China, for example? We're talking about 20% of the planet there, and if there's not alignment in some of the core sort of goals for the platform, then that gets pretty shaky too.
Well, one of the things. Okay, so here is one of my big critiques of the contemporary articulation of the metaverse, is that for 3 or 4 decades now, people have effectively talked about the metaverse the same way. And it is generally considered to be this kind of exclusively digital stroke virtual domain. And I really kind of want to push back on that a little bit, because I think it that point of view, it abstracts itself from the improvements to and evolution of technology over the last decade in particular. And I think it's clear now that the most likely metaverse, by the time it reaches a degree of sophistication and maturity that we're all content to call it the metaverse, or whatever branded name it has at that stage, but that also integrates the real world as well, and analog infrastructure. So in all likelihood, the metaverse is going to be situated across two domains. It will exist in this virtual space, but it's also going to cross over and layer itself on top of the analog infrastructure all around us. And as that analog infrastructure becomes connected through IoT infrastructure, and then after that, bio-augmentation and devices associated with bio-augmentation, what we have is a metaverse that connects the individual, the infrastructure all around us, and virtual platforms to create something which is genuinely transcendent. And your virtual assets and virtual infrastructure needs to move seamlessly between all of these platforms. The simple example that I often use is that of a pet. So if you create a pet on a particular virtual platform, say you've got some kind of half dragon, half badger pet that you've named and follows you everywhere within a particular game, well, that should also be available to you when you are walking around in your day to day and you're wearing either mixed reality glasses or beyond that, mixed reality contact lenses, which is something we've done a lot of work on. And then, further down the field, like in 3 decades' time, we could be looking at things like synthetic eyeballs that are totally loaded up with tech to the point that the sophistication of the interaction with the physical world is far more pronounced. But people need to realize that the metaverse has already creeped out of the virtual environment and is already beginning to exist all around us. And you can see the massive investment from Google and Facebook in particular, and Apple as well to an extent, in the lens infrastructure. And there's a ton of companies investing in it, but contact lenses and glasses. Google Glass never died. It was just put on a shelf for a while, and now it's coming back. And it's going to be a really significant part of the next decade, those sort of technologies, and it's going to open up a whole new world to us, multiple universes that kind of sit on top of each other in a strataverse of new realities that are different for every person. I think that's a key point for me, is that the metaverse no longer exists just within a box, just in a virtual plane. It's spread outside of that, and now it's creeping into the real world as well.
Absolutely. I'm hugely excited by the whole future of sort of wearables and, as you say, that kind of the augmented age that we're heading for. I'm yet to be completely sold on the contact lenses side of things, though. It seems like a crazy technical feat to be able to condense any form of high resolution display down to something that, power and size and weight efficient. Is there anything particularly notable that you've seen in your sort of research around that area?
Yeah, I mean, there's a ton of patents already for contact lenses, and there are working demos of contact lenses that are human powered. So they have small gold strips in the contact lens, and it's the electricity generated by the body that powers them. But they're really low-fi. They just give directions, for example. They're very, very, very low level data display. So it's things like connecting to a city map or Google Maps type app and able to direct you to the city. But there's the same issues that VR encountered. You can easily make people feel uncomfortable, nausea, headaches, etc. as well. Um, Ultimately, the concept has a lot of money behind it. In terms of readiness, it's about 4 or 5 years away from commercializable examples. you would expect that it's probably going to go through an adoption curve, somewhat like kind of a VR style adoption curve. But the capacity to turn them on, turn them off is going to be interesting. One other example, I think the thing you got to bear in mind is everybody encounters eyesight difficulties at some point during their life, and no one's got perfect eyesight forever. So either glasses or contact lenses become this inevitable product that enters every single person's life at some stage if they last that long. And that makes it a huge opportunity space because it's such an intimate object. And some of the technology that's been developed in it so far, there's, I think it was UC San Diego, have recently built prototypes of contact lenses that allow you to blink and focus. So they're like small telescopes. You can see further after you do a double blink. And the technique is very complicated, but the technology is not. And these contact lenses are not particularly uncomfortable or anything else. So, but that's a single feature. So that's a single feature tool. But you can see straight away why that might actually be relevant. Now, if you can begin to build contact lenses with multiple features on them, so that are blink or cognitively orientated and are triggered in some way, that becomes fascinating. And I think the thing to bear in mind more than anything else is more so than ever before, where we sit in a point of technological history where technologies are intersecting with each other at an extraordinary rate, and you can't look at one technology in a linear way anymore. You've got to assume it's going to interact with other technologies. So, to what extent the actual contact lens infrastructure needs to be able to do everything itself is probably quite limited. You're looking at, depending on a lot of the physical infrastructure around it to support its capability, cloud infrastructure, obviously, and then AI and things like, like real-time ray tracing and stuff is going to be a huge part of it. So it's there. It's not just it's not a single technology on its own. It shouldn't be considered like that. I think it needs to be considered with a lot of the bio-augmentation technologies that have been developed, the kind of cognitive adaptation technologies that have been developed. Obviously, things like AI and AI, especially when it comes to graphics. So I think a lot of those, and then the physical infrastructure that IoT will support. So there, I certainly wouldn't write it off. I would expect that there's both a huge demand for it, and there's obviously this huge opportunity by virtue of the fact that all of us will likely at some point require either something that sits over our eyes or on our eyes. And that means that inevitably we will see people continue to experiment with it. Like it's the you just need to take a step back. Like glasses have obviously been refined significantly in terms of their own technological spec over time. Like glasses now are far better than glasses were 50 years ago. And the same with contact lenses. The technology behind contact lenses have improved significantly over time as well. That will continue to be the case. They're massive, massive industries. So even the incumbents in these spaces that make glasses and make contact lenses, they've got their own innovation teams and applied science labs, and they're trying to figure out new ways of augmenting them and making them better, faster, cheaper. So I would certainly not write it off. I don't think it sits in the realm of science fiction. But I do think that we'll see in the next 10 years whether or not it's reasonable in its current form as a contact lens, or whether or not we'll have to wait on to the kind of the 3D printed eyeball stage of development to see that.
That's really interesting. You make two really great points there. One on the kind of convergence of sort of multiple different, almost exponential technologies right now, unlocking accelerated change, and obviously as humans we're not very good at thinking exponentially and whatnot. So that's a great point. And the other one being the kind of trend of increased intimacy between our devices has long been in motion. Obviously we're mobile and now all these wearables and whatnot. It's very easy to see that continue. So yeah, I mean, beyond some of these kind of things, the contact lens probably belongs to the realm of kind of mediums through which we'd interact with this new world. But what are the kind of main technical constraints around this concept of a metaverse or the strataverse, as you described, coming to fruition, and what appear to be the most promising solutions in those areas as well?
Hard question to answer. So if I talk about that idea of the strataverse, yeah, that's very much kind of an IoT extension to the metaverse. It's how we begin to fit public infrastructure with sensors, and with cameras and with the infrastructure and screen technology, obviously, and interactive technology that facilitates more engagement with the world around us. But it's not just that world around us, because it's the idea that we can, if we take a step back, there's this idea that unites us all, that makes us all common, which is this desire to construct or to create a world of our own design. And it's something we all do every single day. We get up in the morning and we go out and we try all day long to make the world fit the way we want it to work. We try and edit it. And even though we know we'll never achieve it, it's what drives us all. And it drives all innovation. And increasingly, technology is not solving for that, but it's facilitating a greater degree of change per person, or editorial authority per person. And I think that this idea of the strataverse is just a heightened level of that. Now, let's assume it's through some sort of glassware to begin with. The idea that we can construct these realities and filters that are, and we see simple filters all the time now. There's I saw some simple kind of filter technology today that was AR technology that made everyone smile. So somebody was in the tube in London, and the AR filter they had just forced everyone to smile. So everyone's kind of Monday morning frown all of a sudden became a smile, and it's a very simple example. But when you begin to extrapolate from that, what you begin to see is this creative capacity to design the world around you, to insert flower boxes in every window, to put kind of landscaping in cities where there isn't much, to begin to create and craft creatures that populate the sky all around you. To brighten up a day, literally, and then beyond that, to allow infrastructure to interact with you. So, simple example is a restaurant that is on the same assistant-based platform as you are might be able to interact with you visually. So that means that if they have an offer specific for you, it's lunchtime, they can signal that offer by colors, for instance, or by highlighting themselves in your field of vision. But all of that is, with that technology, is not particularly complex. It requires the medium, the proxy, to facilitate it. But a lot of the existing, the speed issues have been resolved. It doesn't require 6G or anything. The IoT infrastructure is being built and being developed, and we're likely to see it in places like South Korea first, I suppose, I would expect. But it's all kind of on the precipice of it. So on that side of things, and also, sorry, the data streams as well. So the ability for individuals to to personalize their experience through the acquisition of data streams and the cultivation of proprietary data is going to be another part of it. So and the way that might manifest is so myriad. But like an example might be, again, like, are there color themes, data identification of the people around you. So ways of identifying people based on different criteria, or identifying a potential threat, whatever that might be as well, based on the data that you have access to. That could be data access to public records. That could be access to the data that you streams that you buy yourself. And then those data streams become financial assets in and of themselves, but they need somewhere to be transacted. So you've got a marketplace that develops around it. On the metaverse side of things, and I think if you go back over the last 30 years, the metaverse has generally been considered to be a VR undertaking, that it would be virtual reality that facilitated the metaverse. And I think a lot of people increasingly are questioning that. And not that I think VR just hasn't developed at the rate that people hoped it would. It hasn't reached that point of critical mass. And it still feels, I think, even to advocates of VR, it's still missing something. There's something which makes VR, and partly it's just critical mass of participants. There's not enough people involved. There's not enough game publishers developing for it, and then there's also too much of a game dependency. We haven't seen enough education and work development port to VR, and maybe that'll come over time. But I think, like I mentioned already, but the biggest technical blocks to the maturation of the multiverse are interoperability between platforms, which is an enormous issue. And I don't think the multiverse really works or comes to fruition until that's resolved. Because if I spend 20 hours a week playing like Call of Duty, and I want to be able to take some of the value of that and port it elsewhere, I'm not able to do that. If I want to, or even for more open games like Minecraft or EVE Online, I'm not able to take that value and use it elsewhere. And ultimately, the multiverse, in large part, is the ability to be able to say, okay, look, if you are a big EVE Online player and you've got a significant asset holding in EVE Online, I shall be able to liquidate that position, and I shall be able to use that value in exchange for something else, like, for instance, maybe education. Like, I could get some sort of online degree or something, or I could get access to certain clubs or certain facilities or certain opportunities that I wouldn't have access to otherwise. Now, in a metaverse reality, those opportunities are ones that have not really been developed yet, I'd expect. But that is an enormous challenge. So the interoperability is the first one. The second one is about the financial infrastructure that needs to revolve around an idea of anonymity, which just doesn't exist at the moment. It's not possible. AML and KYC laws globally would not really facilitate an economic infrastructure that could do authorization, identification, and authentication without knowing who the root identity is. I think that philosophically and theoretically can be resolved. I just think we're a long way away from that, because it will need to be facilitated by institutions of finance like banks who, by and large, don't understand this space yet, and certainly don't understand how you could do authentication, authorization, identification without knowing who the root individual is and what those funds will be used for. And that's an enormous, enormous technical issue, um, I would suggest. Obviously, there are workarounds for this, and people might suggest, look, we could use something like Monero to do workarounds for this, and yeah, feasibly, but I, 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 I would question the feasibility of being able to do simple payments and transactions at a very, very wide scale on networks like that.
Mm. Yeah, I find it super interesting. I probably agree with that sort of order of events about this idea of a strataverse kind of first emerging, because you can see, as you say, how some of the technical applications required to animate the world around us are very much there already, and you could see how they'd work sort of in synergy to existing kind of businesses and our kind of consumer trends. The devil's advocate might suggest, though, that once we unlock this ability to effectively terraform, right, in a digital manner, and change sad faces to happy ones and put flowers in windows and whatnot, the devil's advocate might suggest that in some way that sort of degrades the human experience by making us more accustomed to a kind of inauthentic mode of being. What kind of are your thoughts around that? And then sort of from a philosophical perspective, what kind of what is there, I guess, to be excited about, and what is there to be mindful of with regard to our gradual transformation into a predominantly digital species?
I feel like that was a question that you asked for the sake of asking it, not because you believed it necessarily. So that was very decent of you. So I think, so one quick preempt to that, which is the reason why the idea of a strataverse seems to be accelerating faster, and I would expect will take hold quicker, is because it's the technology coming to people rather than asking the people to come to technology, which is always a challenge. When you're saying, look, the opportunity is over here, you just need to learn how to use it. The incentives are challenging there. We saw it with crypto at one point because the incentives were enormous. But aside from that, there are a few examples when you reach a critical mass of people who would rush to the technology. Generally, it's the other way around. The technology rushes to the people, and then that facilitates rapid growth. But to your question about the kind of degradation of the human condition through increased virtuality in our lives, I think that you would probably need to be a philosopher to answer that question, because it's rooted in an understanding of what the human condition is. I think if I was playing devil's advocate to your devil's advocate, I would suggest that it is inherently human to continue to evolve and to change and to integrate, and to improve ourselves. And that is something we've seen time and time again, that when we develop a technology that can improve us in some way, we tend to do so. I mean, I think that if we went back in time, maybe not, but I could probably use the same argument to advocate against advances in medicine, for instance, and to say, no, the human condition is to die at 35. That's the human condition. And we shouldn't argue against that. And obviously, there have been religious zealots throughout history who've made arguments similar to that. And there's risk, and what it means to a degree is we're going to experience change, which will seem very unfamiliar to people. And another element or aspect of the human condition is that we tend to be within a generation, we tend to be very resistant to change. And across generations, we tend to be extraordinarily comfortable with it. But that will be a challenge, especially as it's happening faster, because the rate of technological evolution is so rapid now. It's extraordinarily difficult for people who the technology has passed by to facilitate, understand, or accept that change. I think we see that now across a number of different philosophical ideas that are not technological. The world, from my parents' time to my time, the world culturally has changed so much that I often think it must be difficult to get their heads around certain ideas now that I take for granted because it's so unfamiliar to them. And I can only assume that that rate will increase even faster through my lifetime. So I would suggest that yes, there will certainly be risks and there will be mistakes that we make. But I think, and I've talked about this before, my kind of feeling is the human condition at this point is to evolve well past the point of our existing humanity. So the idea of transhumanism and posthumanism then is a real consideration. I don't think that humans in 1,000 years will resemble humans today. I think that would be very strange at our current rate of progress if they did. Would be my feeling.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree, and think we should be more inclined to generally embrace things, but also recognize, as you say, actually how significant and dramatic those changes could be in the not so distant future. Reminds me of one of my favorite books, actually, called Last and First Men by Olaf Stapledon. Have you ever come across it?
No.
I think you'd enjoy that one. But
I will give it
yeah.
a look. Always looking for book recommendations.
There we go. Okay, then I guess kind of still touching on that philosophical side of things, what stands out to you the most? What are you most sort of excited by in terms of our current direction of travel? Let's tame the time horizon and say the 21st century. What are you most excited about?
We have the whole 21st century. Yeah. uh, I think, okay, two things that I'm really interested in at the moment. And for me, they're both related to the broader metaverse conversation, but not directly. Two areas are bio-augmentation and material science. I think people sometimes forget how fundamentally advances in material science have affected the world around us. Like the Bronze Age, there was a whole age named after an advancement in material science. The use of the introduction of concrete and how that changed the world over and over and over again. Steel as well, obviously. We have found ways to advance society and the world around us so fundamentally through material science. And it seems, and I'm no expert in material science, but from reading as much as I can about it, it does seem like we're on the precipice of a great age of materials. Obviously, everyone's familiar with things like graphene, but there's more and more micro thin, like, kind of single atom types of materials being developed now, and then also explorations in color as well, that I think are going to change the way we exist in the world around us, and the world around us exists with us too. Obviously, things like, for instance, an advancement in material science coordinated with advancements in nanotech, in biotech, and in horticultural science will fundamentally change the way that we construct buildings, for instance. So again, okay, within the 21st century, buildings, we're in this kind of weird, peculiar, dark age for buildings, for city buildings at the moment. We went from an age where buildings were certainly not environmentally friendly, but they were kind of human artifacts. They were celebrations of creativity and capacity, and now to this era of buildings looking remarkably similar to each other. A large commercial building is a large commercial building, and they tend to look the same everywhere. But what we've done is we've significantly advanced the way these buildings actually function. Now, I think the next kind of age of this is to try and combine that utility with a more design-based approach to the environment that it interacts with. And that could lead to buildings that look absolutely nothing like they do now. The rules for design and architecture will change fundamentally. So I think that's going to be a really interesting one, because it's such the urban environment, whether that's small or large, the physical environment that we build on the earth, that is such a fundamental part of human existence, and that's something which I think can see real change over the next few decades. And one of the reasons why that's so important is because population growth has been so rapid over the last 40, 50 years that cities themselves have not been able to grow at the same rate as their population increase. And the consequence of that is the peripheries of cities have now become these hellscapes that are impossible to live in, and have a really, really materially negative impact on people's lives. And it's pushed up the prices of property closer to cities to extraordinary levels that have created these massive wealth inequalities. And as we continue, and it will change, I expect, but we continue to center commercial activity around urban centers. So we've created unintentionally this extraordinary inequality that benefits enormously people who are fortunate enough to buy a building or buy space, buy land close to the center of a city at a time when it was cheap and likely affordable to many. But they happened to be, there was no skill involved, there was no value created, but the result of it has been massive wealth and income inequalities as a consequence. And you begin to look then at how the city needs to be redesigned to facilitate a more equitable society, and this becomes a significant part of that. The other one I mentioned was bio-augmentation. I think this is a fascinating space. We already, again, another space where there's a long history of it. People think about like your cosmetic surgery is something which has been totally normalized now. Like most of the people that we look at on our screens have had cosmetic surgery. It's totally acceptable in society for most people. It's not unusual. So we know there's a massive industry around bio-augmentation, and that's a pretty fundamental form of bio-augmentation. But what we're likely to see are the introduction of far more implants and kind of technical augmentation over the next 2 decades, which I think again will augment human capacity, augment our creativity, our cognitive ability, our ability to network, to socialize, to interact with the world around us, and you would expect it will also develop new senses as well. So we'll move to sensorial kind of domains beyond what we're traditionally used to. All of that, I think, is fascinating and changes the nature of humanity in the world that we exist in. They're both obviously related to the metaverse, although tangentially, and they're both kind of important over the next 2 decades.
Absolutely, I think that's a great answer. I particularly like the one on the sort of buildings and where we're moving with that. Read some really interesting stuff around buildings starting as we can kind of print them with greater sort of technical detail, starting to mimic like organic structures much more, which are much more efficient and moving away from these hard edges and stuff. But agree, massively fundamental role in the human experience. That'll be super interesting to see. And then, obviously the bio-augmentation side is really cool. We've already got some, hobbyists out there who have LEDs under their skin and whatnot. I wouldn't personally touch them yet, but one day soon. Out of curiosity, I had a question. You were on Andrew Zimmer-Red podcast recently, which I'm a big fan of, and you kind of expressed negative sentiment towards Bostrom's simulation theory. I was curious whether you wanted to shed a bit more light on that.
Ask me a specific question about it, because otherwise we'll be here all day.
You just said it was only said in passing, but basically mentioned, you said you're glad that he didn't subscribe. It was in the context of AI and basically us evolving with it. And you said you were glad that he didn't subscribe to the sort of Elon Musk driven school of we're all in a simulation.
Well, so the reason I was asking for more specificity was because I wanted to know if you meant my critique of Musk or my critique of the theory. That's a curious question. I think that, look, I'm in no position to speak at length, or certainly from the point of view of an expert, about the philosophy of our existence. But I do think the suggestion of simulation theory is great for a novel. But I think beyond that, it's a total thought experiment. There's no logical framework, I think, that you can apply effectively, which makes it convincing. In my view, I think Musk's understanding of it, I have to be careful what I say here. I think Elon Musk is obviously a fascinating caricature. Like, what an interesting cartoon for the world to have created. And it's no coincidence, I suppose, that we constructed this kind of archetypical caricature at a time when we saw this mainstreaming of, kind of superheroes and everything through the introduction of the Marvel universe, the greater kind of the broader psyche, social psyche. So we tried to create this Iron Man equivalent who was certainly smart enough and wealthy enough from a very young age to ensure that he had the public reach necessary to make sure that that was a convincing narrative. And I think the problem with that, though, is that because Elon Musk is obviously a very wealthy guy and successful by some measures, I think it's clear that he, like anybody, you can't be an expert in everything. But the problem becomes then when what we've seen over the last number of years is this weird convergence of business and society and culture and philosophy to an extent, based on certain attitudinal constructs that have increasingly become kind of left and right, and right being this kind of more nationalistic, ultra capitalist, like neoliberal version of the world, and then this left view, which is seen as more socially progressive, more financially fair or equitable. And I think to that question, my issue with it was that you have this very prominent individual who is very, very happy to give his opinion about anything every time he's asked, but a huge audience, layering in these ideas that really don't have a significant substance, that are speculative and interesting thought experiments. But this is something which kind of happens all the time. And, if it's Elon Musk or if it's Jordan Peterson, or if it is Stefan Molyneux, or if whoever Joe Rogan's next podcast guest is, Alex Jones, whatever fringe thinker, radical nationalist, xenophobe Rogan wants to have on his podcast next, that's a massive audience. And you begin to see that regurgitated over and over again in popular rhetoric. And I think there's a real problem with that. I mean, that's something which I find concerning, the mainstreaming of conspiracy theories, the kind of degradation of expertise, the acceptance of celebrity as a form of expertise or a form of suitability or a form of experience or credentials, I think is problematic as well. And in that as well, we've totally denigrated those people who've dedicated their lives to understanding and nuance, and the people who are best placed to actually give a point of view are now the last people we ever ask for an opinion. And I think that's very, very worrying. So I think my point there was multifold. One was simulation theory itself was something which I think philosophically it's meant to be controversial, and it's very, very fringe, and there's no logical construct to the postulation in the first place, in my view, from what I've read anyway. I think there's lots of really effective arguments against it. But the second, and the problem with simulation theory as well, in parts, is that it implies this kind of deity. Like there's a deification process as well. Somebody created the simulation. Did somebody else create that simulation? Are we within the simulation? The simulation ultimately it implies this intelligent design function. It's more sophisticated than intelligent design in modern discourse, but still, it's problematic. The other layer, though, the reason I said it on the podcast, is probably more to do with the mainstreaming of fringe ideas through virality and celebrity, and the acceptance of credentials based on popularity rather than proof, rather than like cynical assessment. That we now are in a position where, if we're told by enough people that somebody is brilliant, we believe that a person is brilliant. And that's always been the case. It's part, again, of the human condition. But the concern now is that it can happen so quickly, and that person can, through virality, can wreak so much havoc in such a short span of time that can be difficult to actually constrict.
Absolutely. Well, yeah, it was a bit of a curveball question, but there you go. That was a great articulation, though, of something that I feel very strongly about also. So interesting comments, and agree with all of that for the most part.
Hey guys, I wanted to tell you how easy it is to open and fund an Alto crypto IRA. All you have to do is open a traditional Roth or SEP crypto IRA account, then get ready to invest. An Alto crypto IRA is specifically designed for crypto investments. You custody with Coinbase, trading's tax-free, investment minimums are as low as $10, and gains grow tax-deferred, meaning you don't pay taxes until you start to take money out of your IRA. You can visit and open an account by visiting altoira.com/chainreaction.
I guess we'll reground a bit. I was going to ask, what do you see as the primary path to adoption, first for sort of digital assets and NFTs, and ultimately this idea of a metaverse?
Could you say that first part again, please, Piers?
Sorry, the sort of primary path to adoption, I guess, predominantly for these digital assets and NFTs to begin with.
So I think gaming is a fantastic. So distributed ledgers in gaming makes so much sense. You've already got a massive, digitally fluent, technologically savvy audience of people who are willing to experiment. There's community constructs that originate around them. I think NFTs in gaming is going to be a really significant story over the next decade. So for me, that will mainstream a lot of it, because what we'll begin to see then, very simple example, if you can get a creative community to begin to construct virtual assets that can sell onto a marketplace, and a marketplace that marketplace may well be a gaming oriented marketplace, that's a use case which has enormous potential, and it pays this creative class of people as well for their time and effort to construct whatever these virtual assets happen to be. They're usable across platforms. They're tradable and transactable, and then all of a sudden you'll have stories of 14-year-olds who are worth $1 million or €1 million or whatever, and that's going to get people's attention. And that idea of the opportunity for a wealth realignment, because right now, for people who the rules of life, like the idea of the American dream and the adoption of the American dream by many Western societies, is that if you work very hard and you obey all of the rules, so you don't commit a crime, you go to college, you get a good job, you'll get promoted, you'll be able to buy a nice home, go on 2 holidays a year, own 2 cars, etc., etc. That obviously does not exist anymore. Now, for the people who are at the top of their class, get the best degrees, get really good jobs, they're barely able to afford their rent at the end of the month. Never mind actually buy a home or have that sort of discretionary wealth necessary to have an indulgent or luxurious lifestyle. So the opportunity for a new mechanism to come along and correct some of that, and I don't mean at a large scale necessarily, but the opportunity will exist for people who are capable of creating the assets or using the assets in the right way. There's an opportunity for people to leverage that and to invert the economic construct of today's world. And I think that's going to get people's attention. And what we'll likely see then are more and more people using the metaverse as a form of supplemental income to begin with. So it won't be their primary income, but maybe you'll have designers who, like once a week, they're designing some sort of new asset to trade into a particular platform, and maybe they're making like a couple of €100 off of it. And then for more popular ones, or for artists, for instance, maybe they're making a couple of thousand or a few thousand a month off some of the work they're doing here. And all of a sudden, they've changed their income profile in quite a dramatic way. And there'll obviously be massive success stories in that as well. But that, I think, that's the dynamic which I think gets it to critical mass. The fact that it can be fundamentally useful. It solves a problem that has manifested within the economic and social system we've constructed over the last 30 years, that puts younger people in particular at a significant disadvantage over the rest of their life when it comes to their income profile. This is an opportunity for those who are digitally and technically savvy to begin to correct some of that in a real way. And for me, that's the thing that will push it to critical mass, and all of the infrastructure will fall in behind that to facilitate it, because a lot of people will make money from it.
I love that. Completely agree as well. You see, even these, obviously we're still very early on, but all of the creators in these existing games, especially around the crypto space, I mean, once people get a taste of it, they kind of get pretty hooked. We've seen some people, designing some really, really cool stuff already. So kind of, continuing on from that, what new business models do you see on the horizon that you think will maybe eventually dominate, or you just find interesting in their own right? Beyond just the creator economy, I mean, the ways we're likely to evolve.
Yeah, okay, it's a good one. So I think, what we're probably seeing at the moment are some of the ingredients of maybe if I take a step back and not speak directly to the business models, but the componentry that's coming together. So we've seen the success of like a lot of the collectibles, and I think most people can look at the collectibles and say, look, we get the underlying interest here, but a lot of the collectibles we've seen are not particularly interesting. They're also not particularly usable. That doesn't really matter because a collectible could be a piece of art, for instance, and that has like a piece of art in the real world that has value on its own merit. But what we haven't seen a particularly successful, or sorry, a particularly sophisticated collectibles mechanism yet. So that's one part of it. We've seen there's interest there. We'll see it. We're seeing it's emerging. Then we also see the creation of more advanced forms of NFT infrastructure and spaces like we see in CryptoVoxels and Somnium Space and Decentraland, where you've got these open cityscapes that are almost like browsers for the metaverse. Like how do you navigate the metaverse? Well, you go to one of these cityscapes and then you can navigate through the city to get to the place you want to. I think that's another form of environment building. So we begin to see then, and gaming obviously, and there's lots of blockchain gaming now, but I think these three components kind of coming together begin to give us a sense, or some signals at least, of how this is likely to evolve. My contention is still that we're likely to see some of the more successful manifestation of this in the real world first. So the idea of like a blockchain based game that's collectibles orientated, that works a little bit more like Pokemon Go, I think is probably something that we'll see be successful in the next 5 years. And games like that, and that's in the same way that we saw a massive explosion in mobile strategy games like 7, 8, 9 years ago. So all the Clash of Clans type things, and they made a ton of money because the technology aligned, the interest was there, you had a critical mass of people, and they made a ton of money. I think we're going to see something similar, a spate of those type of games where the business model is based upon the market exchange mechanisms rather than the playing of the game. So it's going to be all about intermediary fees for the different transactions that take place, which for the user, the player, will feel much fairer. You won't have any kind of loot box equivalent. You won't be paying to play. All of that will be free
Absolutely.
access to sophisticated gaming. And the success that you have is your success. But if you want to buy assets or sell assets that you have, that you've earned, there will be a fee for using the exchange, which I think people are totally familiar with. It's totally normal. People don't have an issue with that unless like it's a rip off. But I think that's the model that a lot of these platforms are going to build around, the exchange mechanism model. And like some of the exchanges are already there, like OpenSeas, for instance, are going to play a significant role in this. But you will likely see some of the gaming platforms benefiting from this as well. Obviously, they'll look to create their own assets too, their own NFTs to sell into it. But that to me, I think is a really attractive proposition to create the market, to attract the players, to generate the interest, and then to both sell assets into that environment, but also to facilitate the exchange of assets and to benefit from that exchange because you're then benefiting from the actual success and satisfaction of the players.
Absolutely. I think, no, couldn't agree more around the sort of marketplace side of things. I think especially the way we're starting to see that manifest even in areas like fashion right now with these sort of limited edition item drops, where the entire business model shifts because now the focus is on, being able to unlock previously impossible revenue streams from secondary market feeds, even on like physical goods, which, super excited to see where all of that goes.
Well, so like even with fashion, there's so many opportunities here because first of all, I think designers are going to need to start hiring new types of designers. Like labels will need to hire people who design specifically for virtual, and that's a whole new skill set, which is going to be really interesting because things that are totally couture in the real world are totally normal or even kind of banal in the virtual world. So that requires a new set of skills. But beyond that, then there's different ways they could approach it. So you could have, for example, if somebody wants to buy like a Tom Ford suit, it's going to cost them maybe $3,000 to get this suit. Well, maybe then Tom Ford want to say, well, okay, look, what we're going to do is we're going to give you a virtual Tom Ford suit as well, along with this. So if you buy this one, then you also get the virtual asset, which you can use across these platforms. And it's like, maybe for now it could be whatever platform, but like in the future, you're hoping that it's interoperable platforms that they can use for their avatar wherever they are. and now you've got the status symbol that you got as an accessory to the real world purchase. Or of course, there's the other way where you can do that. Like if you do another Marshmallow Travis Scott type concert
Hmm.
in Fortnite, then you've got merch drops and you've got an NFT construct that allows you to establish that these were only for the people who got them at the concert. That's an obvious one, but there's so many different ways that the fashion stuff can spin. It's really fascinating.
Yeah, I find it amazing as well how much has actually already happened there. Even going back to sort of early 2010s with I think it was Final Fantasy doing
Yeah,
some collabs with some big fashion brands, and then who was it? It was Louis Vuitton, I think, doing
yeah,
the
League
League
of
of Legends
Legends.
champion
Yeah.
skins in the World Cup and whatnot. So no, all super interesting. Again, kind of leading on from there, and I know this might not be representative of L'Atelier or whatever, but personally, what do you find in terms of investable surface area? What do you find the most compelling and why?
Oh, interesting. So I suppose with investments, it depends on what. I don't mean to skirt your question, but it depends on whether or not you are looking to make kind of a quick buck or like a long term investment in something. And
Let's say long term sound fundamentally, you're convicted in this as an idea and think it's going to rise to prominence on the 10-20 year horizon.
well, yeah, then the question becomes: am I looking at investing in assets like an NFT, or am I investing in equity like a business? It's different. I think my approach will be quite different. I think there are. Yeah, I'm very bullish on the exchanges. I think anything that is developing a sophisticated NFT exchange right now, I think is something which is going to do well over time. And there's obviously, without dropping brand names, there's obviously a few there that are very good and they're improving. But I think that deserves further investment. I think that they're going to surpass what the crypto exchanges did 2, 3, 4 years ago, and they'll move beyond that as tools that people use. Um, I I'm hesitant given my position to actually mention companies, but I think companies that are exploring interoperable ID is something that we've looked at quite a lot. Uh, it's a really difficult challenge. It's a really technical challenge, but I think it's one that's required. So, and then the other one, I think, if you're kind of speculating at the moment, I think like NFT based art is a really kind of fun thing to speculate in, because I think in 10, 20 years time, a lot of this stuff will kind of be pioneering, and ultimately there'll only be one of them. And I think that some of these people, as they rise to prominence, this is kind of an interesting speculative space for new art, which is kind of fascinating. But generally speaking, interoperability is a key theme. And I think a lot of your listeners will understand, will read between the lines here, but I think refusing to be interoperable is problematic. It's going to inhibit your growth. It's not going to accelerate it. So platforms that actively prevent interoperability, especially for assets and avatars, I think is that's something I would stay clear of.
Hmm. For sure. Also agree on the art side there. I think in particular the async guys and starting to develop this idea of programmable art that you can tie to external events and whatnot, that kind of evolve in a dynamic over time. I think that's a super interesting area. And then kind of going onto a few closing questions here. We touched upon a few when we spoke last week, but what's your favorite video game ever if you had to choose?
So my favorite video games ever. Oh, so my favorite video games ever. So this is going to sound a little bit cliched, but over the last 2 years, my favorite two video games have been God of War and Red Dead Redemption 2. I like I'm probably like I'm in my mid 30s, so I grew up with console based games. So I definitely have, like, I still play a lot of remote games, and I love the new God of War. I thought it was fantastic. I really,
Agreed.
really, really enjoyed it. I really looking forward to the next one. And I thought Red Dead Redemption 2 was one of the technological accomplishments of the year. I thought it was just absolutely absorbing, marvelous, great storytelling. I thought it was a real breakthrough in terms of gaming capacity and what's possible. I think opened a lot of people's eyes to what the future of open world gaming could be, and how third parties could access those gaming platforms. Like, I fully expect in the future for the online versions of these games, the existing storefront architecture and infrastructure that's there, some of that will be opened up to third parties who are creating their own products to sell through these storefronts. And you could imagine, like somebody who is a third party selling into Red Dead online in Australia on an Australian server, they're able to access a global marketplace to sell off some of their products to people who aren't able to access them directly. And there's a huge opportunity there for both the publisher and the player. But yeah, they're the two that I've really been taken with over the last couple of years.
That's awesome. They're great picks. I was God of War's joint first for me. I actually had a long weekend when that came out. Got one of the top 100 platinum trophies in the world. So I'm obsessed with that game. But yeah,
it's just the storytelling is fantastic. I think like those two games more than any other two games I think have, like, for me, in terms of entertainment generally, like movie and TV and everything, like the two of those are in my top 5 over the last decade.
I agreed. I always said this ever since I first played The Last of Us Part 1, actually. I mean, across any medium, that story just resonated with me so much and completely changed I've always been hardcore into games, but completely changed my perception of them as a storytelling medium.
Yes, yeah.
It's really, really, really awesome to see.
I haven't played the sequel yet, so
yeah, I was going to say I'm halfway through. There's been a lot of talk around it lately, but the mocap and everything's incredible. That's another game changer. And then, yeah, just like tangent to that, what's the best digital experience you've ever had?
Best digital experience? That's a hard question to answer. The best digital experience. I'm kind of coming up stumped here. Because I'm assuming like you mean internet-based digital experience.
Yeah, I mean it can be games. I mean, for me, like obviously in recent years, there's been a lot of like more social elements woven into, be it in VR or, I mean, dare I say it, the Travis Scott concert was pretty wild when the squad was in for that. But yeah, just something along those lines. You mentioned that you play a lot with your brother online and whatnot. Could also qualify.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. So yeah, well, I mean, I that feels kind of normal. It doesn't feel. It doesn't feel novel. I'll give you an example, actually, of something that comes to mind. So this is not one of the best digital experiences I've ever had, but it's certainly one of the most interesting ones because of what it opens up. The city of Helsinki have created a virtual twin of the city. It's called Virtual Helsinki. You can go check it out. And, so you can do a full virtual tour of the city, but they can also host things there, like concerts and exhibitions, etc. And when this came out a couple of years ago, I was really taken with it because it was brave, it was ambitious, and obviously, right now, for instance, if you want to go spend, 3 hours in Helsinki, this opportunity is there for you to go do it in really high spec environments. So I was really taken by that because I felt like this is something which is kind of inevitable. We've talked about virtual tourism for a long time, but the ability to create a virtual twin where you can have exhibits that are exclusively virtual, whether that's, for instance, virtual musicians or virtual artists who exhibit only in this space. You can also create citizenship. So virtual Helsinki, for instance, maybe have a citizenship that is distinct from its analog equivalent. So I thought that was really interesting. It was a brave thing for a municipality to do. I suppose it's not a huge surprise that it's Helsinki and it's Finland. Like it's an innovative country that are really good at all this stuff and are always willing to take a risk, and it's wealthy and stuff too. But I thought that was fascinating because when I saw it, it really triggered kind of a landslide of other ideas and opportunities for how you could use these virtual twins as a tourism opportunity or as an experiment in citizenship and governance. For instance, what if the city of virtual Helsinki, if you wanted to, every citizen of Helsinki could also be a citizen of virtual Helsinki, and you could use it for governance experiments on how to manage the city. And you could actually play them out. You could use it like a model, and you could show people how something would look and how it would work ahead of time. So that could be a new feature, it could be a new building, whatever it was. And think about it from a planning point of view. So if there's a lot of people don't notice planning changes before they happen. So that could be people. It could be the city tearing up trees, or it could be putting a new skyscraper in place of an old building. But what you could do is have a system where all of the kind of the next 3 years of planning might be visible in the virtual twin. So the citizens of the city could actually see the changes that were going to happen. and see if they approve of them or not, or if there's lots you could do with it. And I thought that was that
Absolutely,
was a
that's
really
really cool.
interesting one to kind of see, to experience a city like that, and to get a sense of the culture and the place, and that was cool.
For
Oh, one
sure.
other thing actually. So this, I think there's a fascinating thing that we've observed, particularly in China and Japan over the last number of years, and it's the solutions that have been constructed to try and solve problems related to endemic loneliness, particularly among young men. But in China, China has had this enormous live streaming population for a long time. Like there's like 350 million people actively involved in live streaming in China. And there's a documentary which I'd recommend called People's Republic of Desire. And I think I won't ruin it for people, but that's a fascinating documentary to see. And the digital experience that they document that exists within that, not one that I was personally involved in, but that is a fascinating, the competition is really curious. The other one, I think in Japan, what we've seen a lot of in Japan are relationships with virtual AIs. This has happened for a long time, going back to Nintendo DS, but now we've got more holographics being used. So, like Gatebox is an example of an AI holographic that targets kind of young men who are generally quite lonely and are looking for some form of relationship. And I think there is obviously people come to that with a lot of judgment, but I think that's the beginning of a story which we need to look at with nuance, because yes, there are potentially problems and maybe it exacerbates issues, but at the same time, there's something probably very positive in some of this too, as long as it's balanced. And where ultimately it moves to then is this technology will be used when you combine AI, holographics, the digital assistant platforms, and the data that we have about people. We will begin to see reanimation. So when a loved one dies, we'll see people be reanimated in holographic AI form, and they will continue to improve. And that tends to kind of feel jarring for people. But just to give an opportunity of where, or an example of where it could be an opportunity, is imagine an older person. So, say for instance, you have an older couple, they're both in their 80s, and let's say the husband dies, and the husband, the other husband or wife or whoever it is, wants to continue to live independently. Well, you could create a digital assistant of their dead partner, who could be there with them all the time for the sake of conversation, but also for reminders. Things like, you forgot to lock the door, did you close the window, did you take your
For
tablets?
sure.
If they have an accident, the AI can immediately alert neighbors, family, hospital, emergency services, whatever else. And I think that's a really interesting digital experience to see growing, because it's very much the case.
I know. I think that's fascinating. I mean, there was that Black Mirror episode a while back where they did something similar, and
Yes, with a
not
robot.
without exactly, yeah.
It's when Donald
But
Gleason is in it. Yeah,
yeah,
that's. I mean, look, I think that story is, it's kind of on the nose for people to find it jarring, but ultimately, imagine instead of a robot, imagine it's a hologram, or imagine it's a face on a screen, because we have the data for a lot of people to be able to do that. We've got enough,
absolutely,
we've
yeah,
enough voice data, and like that's voice data. Voice is really complex to fake. It takes a lot of data to do it, to do deep fakes of voice, but that space is moving so quickly. Within 3 years, we'll be able to do high resolution voice adaptation and voice synthetic voice of people. So people have probably seen the Joe Rogan one, but there's that wasn't perfect, but there's a huge amount of voice data. So I think that's inevitable that we begin to see the rollout of that sort of capacity.
absolutely. There's and lots of interesting sort of questions coming up around that. As you say, it tends to jar with most people, but definitely really really interesting, and I can see the appeal in it. And also, know that documentary you mentioned, the People's Republic of Desire. You said that sounds super interesting. Yeah, kind of heading on to the final question here. I was just going to ask. I'm always curious. Out of all the books you've read, which one impacted you the most?
Which one impacted me the most? So I'm not sure if there's one. Um, I'll give a few quickly that I really love. I tend to encourage people a lot to to never stop trying to cultivate their imagination. Like, it's such an important thing to keep a hold of. So I read a lot of I read a lot of fantasy and I read a lot of sci-fi, and I've always tried to continue to do that. And at the same time, I read a lot of history, and I try to read a lot of fiction. So like it's just trying to balance that thing out. So to do foresight work, you have to understand the past. You have to have a good understanding of why today is like today, and then you need to be able to contextualize today, the actions of today in the world that's around us. And if you can do that, then you can begin to understand what the future might look like. And that's the consequence of that has always been, well, I read a lot of history in order to understand the past, and I read a lot of science fiction and fantasy to be able to kind of place that in the future. But a couple of books that I would recommend, or maybe not, well, some I recommend, but some were formative for me. I think the first fantasy book that I read that started me off in fantasy when I was quite young, I was probably 9 or 10, was The Magician by Raymond E. Feist. And I loved that book at the time. I must have read it 6 or 7 times. But it really got me started in fantasy. And then fantasy led me to science fiction. And I read Foundation and Dune when I was quite young. And I know they're classics, but I'm actually rereading Foundation at the moment because the Folio Society were doing a new run of it. So I bought it and I was rereading it in hardback and I'm loving it. But a couple of other ones that I'd really recommend are, there's a book called The House of Leaves, which is a crazy, weird book in so many ways, but without going into too much depth, you have to read it. You can't read it on a Kindle. You have to read the hardback the tactile version of it, because the book itself is an experience, and it's a story about an old man who's found dead by his two neighbors, and the two neighbors find this academic text that this old man has been writing. And it's extraordinarily well referenced. It's really long. It's very dull. And the text is about a documentary called The House of Leaves. So the story itself then is, so the author of the story about the man who wrote the book about the documentary ultimately goes missing. So the book itself is finished by the editor, and there's gaps in it, and there's huge appendices to fill out what some of those gaps, what the editor's impression some of the gaps might be. So the narrative itself is the editor finishing off a book written by an author who was writing a story about a man who wrote an academic text about a documentary about a house. And each one of those stories is in the book, and they all have different tones of voice. And it's quite bizarre, but it's a great experience, and it's unlike any other book I've ever read.
Sounds really interesting.
And the last one I'd say that really profound impact, and I know these aren't particular, like this is not Snow Crash and Ready Player One or whatever else, but another one for me, another novel I'd say is the Adventures of Cavalier and Clay by Michael Chabon, which is just a wonderful novel, especially if anybody likes comics. I think this will resonate with them. It's an epic novel about two cousins that starts just prior to World War II and then runs over the next kind of 5 decades. And it's a brilliant story. So anybody who likes just storytelling and anybody who likes comics, I think will enjoy this, because it is ultimately a story about these two cousins who create comics and build a kind of comic empire in America at that time. And it's fantastic. So there are a couple of books that really stand out to me. I'm sure I love books. I collect books. So I'm forgetting a ton of them here, but there are certainly ones that have made an impact.
Awesome. That sound interesting. Definitely check out that Last and First Men one that I mentioned as well. It kind of explores the evolution of sort of humanity over kind of 18 different, I guess, renditions through, going many billion years into the future, and how we evolve physically and culturally and psychologically and whatnot. Yeah. Super interesting. But yeah, I mean, that's pretty much it on my end. For those listening, is there a particular place people should go to follow more of your stuff, follow more of L'Atelier's work? Where should they find you?
Atelier.net is our website. And if you're looking for me, I'm on Twitter at I am John Egan.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, John. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks, Piers. Really appreciate it.
Hey, everyone. Thanks for listening to the podcast. If you enjoyed it, please support the show by hitting subscribe on iTunes, writing a review, or sharing this episode on Twitter and LinkedIn. And stay tuned for our next episode, out soon.